Now, our assignment for this episode is an essay by Friedrich Nietzsche, who probably has greater name recognition than any other philosophical author. He has a reputation as an implacable iconoclast. But we're going to focus on an essay which came out in 1874 when Nietzsche was just 30. So before he became so famous or had such a dangerous reputation. The essay in question is called Schopenhauer as Erzieher, Schopenhauer as Educator, and it was one of a series of 4 essays which he published under the general title Unzeitgemäße Betrachtungen. The first English translation was called Thoughts Out of Season, which I rather like, but it's usually rendered as Untimely Meditations. Now, I'm not sure that meditations is quite the right word. Nietzsche's essays are too angular and uncomfortable for that. I think observations might be a bit better, but untimely is fine. That's exactly an exact translation of unzeitgemäß. And it's a word that sums up something about Nietzsche's approach to philosophy, that it's not worth anything unless it's contrary, unless it's out of sync with fashion and public opinion, swimming against the historical tide and spitting in the wind. Anyway, I'm very keen to find out, James, what you made of it.
This was fantastic for me, having read quite a bit of Nietzsche in my early 20s, when I was doing my now well-known to listeners of this podcast, battle with Christianity. The Nietzsche who slayed Christianity was very important to me, but I'd never read this text, Schopenhauer as Educator. So it was wonderful to do it for the first time. And reading it, particularly in the context of the philosophers we've been discussing, was tremendous to see connections and lineages. It's not just that Nietzsche quotes from Emerson's essay Circles at the end of his essay. It's also that there's something that he has in common with Emerson and Bradley and Feuerbach and even Mill, even though he's nothing like Mill, which is that these are philosophers who were by and large working outside the university, and who indeed, not in the case of Bradley, but whose philosophical thinking is in some ways facing the world, and is opposed to academic thinking, and so Nietzsche, starts attacking university philosophers, what he calls quarter philosophers. He goes on to attack sort of lecture hall cautiousness, and so just straight off, I liked that. I liked the sense of putting this essay in a family, in a way, this family of philosophers that we've been working through. And then I suppose if we're just doing initial impressions, the second thing is that it isn't really very much about Schopenhauer. It's really about education, or building a culture, with Schopenhauer as a sort of as a godlike, as a deity who will be brought in to be the exemplary figure for this building of a culture.
Yes, indeed. I think if you were looking for kind of basic facts about what kind of a thinker Schopenhauer was, you won't really find out. You won't, this sort of encyclopedia facts about. And Nietzsche doesn't even, I don't think he even mentions that that Schopenhauer's signature doctrine is called pessimism, and that it's based on this rather wonderful idea that we human beings are cursed with a Wille zum Leben, a will to live. And it's a blind drive, which is essentially ridiculous because life is nothing but suffering. So why should we be driven to do it? And that we all have an equally ridiculous will to understand the world, which, given that the world is intrinsically incomprehensible, is also, we're just on a hiding to nothing in everything that we do. And there's a combination of a sense of sadness and a sense of ludicrousness in these doctrines of Schopenhauer's. And I think Nietzsche may allude to the fact that that Chopin had a brief period as a teacher in Berlin, and it was a complete disaster. No one came to his lectures, and he was ridiculed. But then he gave up and spent the remaining 30 or 40 years of his life. He had independent income, just living on his own with his beloved dogs and thinking about how absolutely rotten and ridiculous the world is, and especially human life. Anyway, Nietzsche doesn't really say anything about this. What he focuses on, well, I mean, it's in the title, Erzieher, educator, or it doesn't mean a pedagogue. It means, in Nietzsche's case, he's using it to say an inspiration. I suppose you could say a role model. And for a word he does use, a befreier, a liberator. That's what a teacher needs to be. Not a teacher, but a liberator. He has a genius. This is a word that's important to Schopenhauer and to Nietzsche, both of them. His genius lay not so much in his ideas as in his heroic indifference to the ways of the world. And the example of Schopenhauer, according to Nietzsche, is that he would teach us to be simple and honest in our thinking. He says simple and honest, that is to say, untimely.
Mm. Yes, he praises him for his somewhat bear-like soul. I like that. What he says, the great philosopher will need, as Schopenhauer had, an inflexible and rugged manliness, will be a non-scholar, no need to earn a living, no ties with the state, sort of ideally independent, and yes, possessed of this extraordinary honesty. I think at one moment early in the essay, he says the only other person I can think of who I can put in the same breath in terms of the sort of rugged honesty is Montaigne. In fact, so we have this inspiration. This is the philosopher as the philosopher should be. This is perhaps less clear. This is philosophy as it should be, and he also says that there's an interesting moment where he says that our age has been dominated by three types. There's the Rousseauian man, who's all for revolution and change and dynamism and going against things. There's the more contemplative Goethe figure, a Goethean man who's happier with the status quo, I guess. Many-sided, flexible. And then there's this bear-like, rugged, manly, solitary Schopenhauer, the Schopenhauerian man. And I guess it's this figure whom Nietzsche invokes as you rightly said, as a sort of inspiration for a new culture. But what exactly, I mean, so if I put my literary critical cap on for a second, which is, I hesitate to do it because it feels so piddling and un-Nietzschean, although you could say what's more piddling and un-Nietzschean than a podcast about Nietzsche. But
anyway, Nietzsche says you shouldn't follow anybody, including him. So take courage.
But to put my literary critical cap on for a minute, reading the essay, it's a fantastic essay. It rouses you. There's some marvelous lines. I also like the sort of way he sort of bashes, German and Prussian complacency. 1871 has come about. We have now the state, and there are politicians, but also I think he means the ghost of Hegel. There are politicians and philosophers who are essentially reading history as disguised theodicy, and who are saying the state that's where it is. We couldn't be better than we're just where we should be, right? What he calls the deification of success. We're just where we should be.
And we've just won the war against France. So
right,
proved
exactly.
ourselves to be the leaders of the world.
And I love the way he just aims a bomb at all that. very much, I think, as I know I've mentioned it before, and it was an influence on, a tremendous influence on Nietzsche, but very, very much as Dostoevsky does in Notes from Underground in 1864, just throwing a bomb at utilitarianism, pragmatism, the equation of intelligence and success, or education and material success. Love all that. But with my literary critical hat on, there's no doubt that the term human being has to take an awful lot of strain in this essay. I think at one moment he says, even great Kant was, obviously a great philosopher, but really, by my standard, he was just an academic philosopher. By my standard, he wasn't a philosopher, that's to say, a real human being. And so there's some way in which this magnificent invocation of Schopenhauer and this urge to create a new culture, with all that rousing rhetoric, rests on this sort of receding point, in a way, which is this term, a true human being, or a great individual. And it's not just that, sort of, in educational terms, it's going to be difficult to see how you can systematize that or get that going. It's just also that in a way I know what he means by real human being, honest human being, but in another way I don't.
Yeah, and I think for readers of English translations, it's particularly bad because the Mensch that Nietzsche talks about is kind of gender neutral in German, and I think all the translations are translated as man,
right?
Which, and being a great man. And I'm not saying that Nietzsche would have objected to the masculinist overtones of the translation, but at least it's ambiguous in the original, and it's really striking and irksome in the translation.
Yeah.
But the other thing that's kind of really weird about it as a text is that he's saying this wonderful man was a liberator and inspirer like no one else, and you can say, I know what you're doing, Mr. Writer. You're saying that that's what you want to be. You want us to think that of you. And in a way it's not an ignoble ambition, but he manages to sort of make it look as though he's talking about someone else. But in a way, it's a kind of prospective autobiography, I feel.
Yes, that's what I mean about that sort of receding point. Because, as you say, there's a way in which you read the essay, and the essay is essentially saying, using Schopenhauer as our inspiration, we must build a new culture. That culture will be dedicated to the production of true human beings, great individuals, and really that great individual is me, Nietzsche. And at that point, that seems a very narrow plinth, shall we say, on which to. It's great that it produces Nietzsche, but it's not clear what can be, as I say, how this could be sort of expanded or universalized or systematized in any way in terms of just in terms of how we think generally of education as such.
I think that's true, but it is extraordinary how, in a way, prophetic it was about Nietzsche's own life, because he obviously did become a kind of cultural hero on a massive scale, in a way that Schopenhauer died scarcely remembered, some 10, 15 years before Nietzsche wrote this essay. But Nietzsche was to become, by the end of his life, the last 10 years of his life, he was totally demented. He didn't know what was going on.
Right.
But around him, thanks to his mother and his sister, a huge Nietzsche industry blew up, and with a fantastic reputation, based particularly on one of his later works, which I don't know what you think about it, James, this rather over-the-top, delirious piece of fiction called As of Sprach Zarathustra, Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is describing the sermons of an Eastern prophet who's proclaiming the death of God and denouncing the superficiality of all Western culture. And some Nietzscheans think it's the greatest book ever written. Some Nietzscheans just wish he'd never written it, that it's the biggest turkey in the history of philosophy. I must say I'm rather in the second category. I can't.
Me too. I've actually never been able to read it.
I think I once had to for kind of paid-for reasons, but it doesn't get better. But on the other hand, it really did make an astonishing splash. I mean, I don't think... Do you know, it came out in 1883. So while Nietzsche was sort of at the height of his powers before he became demented. And it reached far beyond the usual circle of philosophical readers, and notably to Richard Strauss and Gustav Mahler. So Richard Strauss writes this enormous orchestral tone poem inspired by Zarathustra, and Mahler's Third Symphony sets some words from it in the final movement. And well, if you were in a way, Schopenhauer as educator is a veiled statement of overweening ambition. I must say, to have your words set by Richard Strauss and Gustav Mahler in your lifetime suggests that the ambition has been fulfilled 100 times over. If not in a particular... I mean, those pieces of music are rather over the top in the same way that, in my opinion, Nietzsche's text is. But
no, that's very true. And I don't want to minimize still the powerful impact of this essay, which, as I say, I was reading for the first time. Reading it, I couldn't help thinking that, yes, it has plenty of application to now. In fact, it's a powerful attack on the ethos of the age, and the ethos of the age, as Nietzsche says, is money making, the greed and power of the state, fake art, beautiful forms, overweening science. And the moment where I really woke up and thought, he's talking about something I know about. He says the university is being infected by the spirit of the age and by the journalist. And what he means is, he sort of says, what they want to do now in universities is they want to have chairs devoted to the study of Goethe and Schiller, and they want to go on and on about, how extraordinary German music is and German culture. And this is nothing to do with the human being, the individual, what the university should actually be doing. I think at one moment, towards the end of the essay, he even says, with great insanity, we need to set up a tribunal that would be outside the university and that would judge what goes on in the university. And that tribunal would ideally be manned by people like Schopenhauer.
Can I say something else about Nietzsche's influence? I think particularly in the English-speaking world. I really mean that, because in Australia and United States and in England, and we're talking of his musical inspiration. There's an absolutely wonderful, huge piece by Frederick Delius based on the text of Also sprach Zarathustra. And in the early days of Nietzsche reception in England, he was regarded, in fact, that there was someone who wrote an essay saying, well, really, Nietzsche is German is John Stuart Mill. The John Stuart Mill of On Liberty, because Nietzsche, like Mill, thinks that all traditional moral codes should be ditched. And he thinks, as Mill says on Liberty, that people it's come down to individuals. We should talk about individuals, not communities, and that individuals should be encouraged to experiment with completely new forms of living. And so this English writer said we should welcome the fact that the Germans have learned the lessons of John Stuart Mill. But most English readers or not really readers, but people who took Nietzsche as an inspiration, even if they didn't read any, were impressed by, he was a symbol of an intellectual rascal. And by saying you were a Nietzschean, you were saying, I don't care for anybody. I'm young and dangerous. And they quote some quotes that go round and round in English. Like, nothing is true, everything is permitted. and the word immoralism. He was and will to power, which was an expression that he used but that his sister really promoted by publishing a work under that title after Nietzsche had lost his mind. And he dealt out insults. This was one of the insults that was loved by these people in the English-speaking world was that George Eliot, she's just one of those ethical girls who was too timid to be a proper atheist. And then this wonderful remark about John Stuart Mill, which I think is really clever, which speaks about his offensive clarity. That is so clever because it's true. You read Mill and you think, my God, I've never read anything so lucid in all my life. But then you also think, does he think I'm so stupid that I wouldn't be able to understand if it wasn't all spelt out in every last detail? So the offensive clarity of Mill is a very good phrase. But I think maybe the main phrase that really took over was, Nietzsche has this concept of the Übermensch, the superhuman being, the superior human being, which has always been translated in a masculinist way as the beyond man. I think that was and then George Bernard Shaw came to the rescue with Superman eventually. Right. And early translators spoke of one of them said, the Übermensch is really a man with a strong body presenting his nation with half a dozen able sons and daughters. And there was, have you come across this Australian-American who ended up in Britain who called himself Ragnar Redbeard? And he was preaching the doctrine of Nietzsche, and he said that Nietzsche's essential doctrine is kind of proto-fascist. I don't think Nietzsche was proto-fascist at all, but Ragnar Redbeard certainly was. He was saying that for Nietzsche, the doctrine is death to the weaklings, wealth to the strong, might is right, and that you should promote a religion of hate. So this movement of young Nietzscheans in the 1890s and 1900s, I think, it really caught on. But Bernard Shaw actually had a nice comment about it. He said, it's worse than shocking. It's simply awful. But it's so foolish that it's going to make people think. And then he added, he was in his 40s at his time, he was in his 40s, that the trouble with these young Nietzscheans is that they make him feel terribly old. And so there is something so exhausting about this Nietzschean movement. I think I just wanted to mention it so that we get rid of it and go back to reading what Nietzsche actually said.
No, I think that's and maybe we'll return to this question of the relation of fascism to Nietzsche's thinking. But for sure, the crude versions of Nietzscheanism persist. In fact, there's this right-wing tech bro called Mark Andreessen, who's sort of in with Peter Thiel and the rest of them. He puts out reading lists every so often, and Nietzsche, the Genealogy of Morals, is regularly on that list. And of course, in some ways, in utterly debased form, I hesitate even to put these two people to invoke our president, such as he is, in relation to Nietzsche. But some terrible debased version is going on with this obsession with winning and losing. Zelensky is a loser, says Trump to him, while humiliating him and bullying him. I'm a winner, and you can only win if you've got me on your side. Otherwise, you're a weakling and need to be booted out of the White House. We're traducing Nietzsche, but something still persists, and the tech bro thing, which is quite hostile to women too. There's just a little thing. I was thinking about it just this morning. Fascism. Obviously, Nietzsche would have been utterly. I mean, he regularly condemns anti-Semitism, but he would have also been, I think, horrified by Hitler's fascism as the embodiment of exactly what he most despises, which is resentment.
Yes.
No doubt about it. That is the mass movement of resentment in the 1930s.
Or indeed kind of thinking with the mob. I mean,
yes.
Because in a way, I mean, his whole point about his individualism is that you should be sufficiently self-confident that you don't even compare yourself with other people. You don't say, I'm a winner, you're a loser. You just say, I'm myself.
Right.
Can you say the same?
Right. Right.
If you want to listen to the rest of this episode and all the episodes in our series, and in fact all the other Close Reading series past and present, then do sign up for the Close Reading subscription for £4.99 a month. There is a link in the episode description